a big and warm welcome to the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia, Dr. Keren Yarhi-Milo, and the former Secretary of State, former Senator for the state of New York, former Democratic nominee for President, Hillary Rodham Clinton.
First of all, I mean, thank you so much for being here, both of you. There's so much to talk about, and that is an understatement. The book that you both edited together is right over there, conveniently, inside the Situation Room. And I mean, there are two sides of the story here. Secretary Clinton, you're a practitioner involved in global decision making at the extremely high level. You, Dr. Yarhi-Milo, you're a scholar. You come from the theory, analyzing theory of decision-making. You're teaching a course together, editing a book together. I guess the first question is how you came together, your friendship, your relationship, and the decision to, start this course together.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good to be with you. Wow. So it all started actually at the house of the former president of Columbia, Lee Bollinger, who when I became dean, he called me and he said, "There is someone I think you would like to meet." And he tells a story, and Hillary tells a story too, that for many, many years he'd been trying to recruit her to come to Columbia. And every time there was, it didn't work out. Maybe she can explain why. But at the end, we got to a point where we finally met at the president's house at the time, after she had met many, many members of the leadership at Columbia. And at the end and when we just sat together, we started talking and we couldn't stop. It was as if, we've known each other for a long time, because the passion from my perspective for the scholarship and what I do in terms of foreign policy decision-making and analysis, and from her part, and we talked about Israel, we talked about the Middle East, we talked about what we could do together at the School of International Public Affairs, we talked about how we could teach together, and this was the beginning of a wonderful, wonderful friendship and partnership, and I am extremely honored to have her as a friend, as a mentor, somebody we taught today, every Wednesday. And it's been wonderful. We started a new institute, the Institute of Global Politics at Columbia, and it's just this. I bring the scholarship, she brings the practitioner's perspective, and it's been very valuable for our students to see that.
Well, I have to say, it was a joy to meet Keren, but also. She is an acknowledged expert in how leaders make decisions. She has studied the psychology, the behavior. She's spent countless hours in archives. And imagine how exciting it was for me to meet somebody who could explain me to me. It was just an incredible opportunity. Because I've learned a lot from her scholarship and talking with her about, where leaders get information, what their own biases are, how their psychology impacts, the people in the room with them, what they think of public opinion, whether or not they really effectively evaluate an adversary or even an ally with respect to what they are seeking. So we began this conversation, as she said, one afternoon at the president's house at Columbia, and it went on from there. So we have now worked together since, I guess, January of 2023, and we created a class together, which this book, Inside the Situation Room, is an edited textbook, because we couldn't find in one place the kind of writings that combined academic specialization with practitioner experience. And so we have both leading academics who are experts in public diplomacy and political science and international relations, political psychology, and we have practitioners from not just the United States. We actually have one European as well, who all agreed to be part of this textbook. And we also started the Institute of Global Politics because, from my perspective, all of the many hours that I spent thinking about, foreign policy, working on it as a senator, as Secretary of State, it was not particularly well informed by the expertise and assessments of the academic community. And from her perspective, to get practitioners to talk about how they saw things, how they experienced things, was an extra benefit for her scholarship. So we started teaching this course. It's a very large course. I think there are now like 400 students in it, about maybe 25, 30% undergraduates, the rest primarily from SEPA, but not exclusively. We have the occasional journalism student. We have the, student from the business school, engineering, et cetera. But it has been an incredible experience, certainly for me to team teach it with her and then to hear from the students, because we made a decision early on that it's a 90-minute course, so we would teach for 70 minutes and then take questions for 20 minutes, and that has been really fascinating, because since we have students from all over the world, the kind of questions they ask, what's on their minds, we ask them to kind of keep it within the subject of the particular class, but that's not always the case, and so we get insights into what young people are thinking about, what's on their minds, what they're worried about.
So I'm going to be like the journalism student in your class, and just I'll bring it to something very topical, a question that would have gone through the Situation Room just in the last few weeks, and that is, of course, the Gaza ceasefire deal. And Secretary Clinton, I just wondered what you thought about the credit that Donald Trump has been given for the ceasefire, and in some ways has claimed for himself. I mean, in Israel, they give him huge credit for brokering the deal. He gives great plaudits to himself for having done the best deal in 3,000 years. Are those plaudits exaggerated, or does he deserve some credit?
Absolutely, he deserves credit. And I have said that publicly. I commended him. I did an interview right after the announcement with Condi Rice on I guess, CBS, as I recall. And I did commend him and his team for getting to the ceasefire. Now, I also pointed out, number one, I think the ceasefire became much more likely because of the, in my view, ill-advised decision by, Prime Minister Netanyahu to bomb Qatar. That opened a door that had not been opened before. And it created pressure, on Trump and on his team to try to get a ceasefire, which I think helped push it over the line. There had been an enormous amount of work done by, frankly, both the Biden administration and the Trump administration to try to figure out what the day after could look like. So the 20-point plan that was presented as, the follow-on to the first step being the ceasefire, the return of all hostages, living and deceased, had been the cumulative result of a lot of American diplomacy and the involvement of, certain countries in the Gulf, Tony Blair, members of both, as I said, the Biden administration, even some people who predated that back to the Bush and the Clinton administration. So there'd been an enormous amount of intellectual capital trying to figure out what we do if we can get to the ceasefire. So the ceasefire, which, got a little wobbly, apparently is back on. But the problem is that is not, as Churchill would say, the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end. It is a first step. And the kind of patience and discipline required to get to the next step and the step after that is what will really test whether or not this was a one-off or whether it has some real potential for, dealing with a lot of the other issues.
But what does it say to you when the president that breaks every rule in the book, in fact, every rule in your book, actually manages to do what many other presidents couldn't do, which is to seem like he is bending or managing to bend Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, I have to say, I was the last person to negotiate a ceasefire between Hamas and Gaza back in 2012, which lasted until, October 7th. So I know how hard it is to negotiate a ceasefire. And there are different ways of doing it. I did it by kind of, shuttle diplomacy, going from Jerusalem to Ramallah, back to Jerusalem to Cairo. So I give him credit, but let's not go too far here. This is the beginning, getting to the ceasefire, which, as I say, had additional pressures that were being, really applied, to Trump and through Trump to Netanyahu. So let's take what we've got. Let's be happy however we got there. Let's get all of the bodies of hostages back, and then let's sort of take stock about where we are now.
I've got a question for the Dean. And it relates in a way to what we've been talking about. A striking idea in the book is the notion of loss and how important that is. That a lot of leaders make decisions that on their face look inexplicable often. And you explain that is because of past losses. Can you just unpack that very interesting idea for this audience?
Sure. So, and this is one of Hillary's favorite theories when we prepared for the class. So this comes from the work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two Israeli-American psychologists who won the Nobel for prospect theory. And it came from behavioral economics and psychology, but it was a very simple idea that people are much more likely to run risks and take a riskier option when they are in a domain of loss compared to when they take, when they're in the domain of gains, and so they will take less risks. So part of it was in political science to try to understand, this is typically what we do in the field, right? How do we take insights from the work that is done in the lab and say, can we explain something in the real world based on those insights? And when you start implementing this, you see a pattern in history that leaders, when they perceive themselves to be in a domain of loss, you would have thought that when somebody has just suffered a loss, they would just be done, or they will just, say, okay, I have to accept a negotiated settlement or make a concession or whatever. But actually, we see the opposite. And that leads to repeated intelligence failures, surprises, and again in history. You can think about it was in 67 to 73. Why? There was already, after a loss, a major war in 1973, after a major victory for Israel in 1967. And that prospect theory explains this. And what the students find it fascinating, and Hillary as well, because even if you look at right now, both explaining Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, both of explaining Benjamin Netanyahu's decision-making after October 7. Before October 7, Bibi was known in Israel as somebody who talks a lot, but is pretty risk-averse. That when it comes to really making decisions that are risky, he's just not going to do it. What we saw is a big change after October 7 in terms of willingness to run risks with Iran, with Hezbollah, and other ones. And the same you talk about Putin. So that is interesting, an interesting observation, but the point that this is one insight that when we talk about international politics, it's about the human element. These are, at the end of the day, people making decisions. And so leaders are not that different from other human beings that are making decisions under conditions of stress, under conditions, incomplete information. And their willingness to run risk depends heavily on their psychology and how they assess the situation from a very biased way. Because somebody would say, it shouldn't necessarily lead to this pattern in behavior, but we see this again and again in history across time and space, which is interesting.
You have in your research, Dean, a lot of that kind of behavioral economics and psychology. And if I could just ask about the two of you and your experiences, you started teaching a class, I think a few weeks before October 7th. And then October 7th happened. So I'm interested in both of your experiences, your feelings in those first hours. You, we should say, are the highest ranking Israeli academic, I think, in the U.S. You had for a while security detail on you. Could you just, both of you, share those experiences of those first days right after October 7th?
Well, it was an incredibly emotional time for us. The October 7th attack happened on a Saturday. By Saturday night, a very dear friend of mine who was in Israel called to tell me that members of her family had been at one of the kibbutzes that had been attacked, and they weren't sure what had happened. They knew that, some were killed, some were missing. It turned out that the parents of 3 young children were killed, and the 2 older siblings had hidden literally for more than 24 hours, but the little toddler daughter had been taken as hostage. So I was on the phone with her listening to what she was finding out in Israel, and she's actually here tonight. And she went on to become one of the most effective American advocates for the release of the hostages, and her great niece eventually was released. But so I went into the week with, all of the feelings about the horrific, barbaric attack, but also this personal connection through my friend. So we taught on Wednesday, and of course, as you said, Yonit, Keren grew up in Israel. She served in the IDF. She was in Unit 8200. Her husband is Israeli. He's here as well, but her family is still in Israel. And so, we had to figure out how to deal, in her case, with the very personal, emotional life experience. And I had to also come to terms with it before we walked into that class. And it was, in many ways, one of the more meaningful experiences, because I thought Keren was absolutely pitch perfect in walking into that classroom. And this was before all of the protests and everything else happened. So this was a Wednesday after the Saturday. And she walked in and she made a presentation to the students and basically, said what had happened. She talked about her own personal feelings, but she also said, you're in a class that is supposed to be training you to figure out how to make hard decisions. And so you have to think about it through that lens. What are the decisions you would be making if you were, for example, not only a leader in Israel, but a leader in the region, a leader in the United States? And then, I talked about how the students had to keep competing thoughts in their head. They had to, number one, understand that Hamas was a terrorist organization that committed a massacre, and Israel had a right to defend itself, and Israel had to obey the rules of war insofar as possible. So we were trying to talk to them in both a personal way, but also bringing in, some of the lessons from the class. And literally, we cut our lecture short. We only talked for like 30 minutes about what we were supposed to talk about. And then we had the students ask questions. The very first student was a Palestinian student. The third student was an Israeli student. So this was in real time. The Palestinian student was, quite emotional, but very defensive, I think it's fair to say. The Israeli student actually knew people who'd been at the music festival and was, very upset and wondering what would happen. And then students from literally all over the world. At the end of the question period, the students gave us a standing ovation. So Karen and I walked down with, oh my God, that was just so incredibly hard. 3 days later, they were calling me a war criminal. So you have to see it from our perspective, because what we saw develop on campus and literally more widely was a very well-organized campaign of protest that was before there'd been ground troops going into Gaza, right? The military action had not happened, but we were already getting bombarded with leaflets and, emotional confrontations and all the rest of it. So we watched how we went from what had been a very authentic, difficult conversation with nearly 400 young people from all over the world, where they listened to each other respectfully, to what happened afterwards. So that was, I think, quite the journey for the two of us.
Look, I was not able to process any of it at the beginning because, as you can imagine, my role is a dean, and a dean of the largest, most international public policy schools in the world. And I knew immediately that this is going to be an issue that will divide our community. And I had at that moment to be everybody's dean. And try to figure out how to steer the community to a point that we have actually constructive dialogue and civil discourse from the beginning. And we told the students, if you want to be leaders, you will have to have difficult conversations. You will have to disagree respectfully with other people. And so what we tried from the beginning is to do exactly that through our class, that we were, able to take different perspectives and analyze the same situations through different lenses. So for them to be able to develop empathic capacity, and empathy is not sympathy, but the ability to put yourself in the shoes of others and see and analyze the situation from their perspective. It wasn't easy. But the other thing that occurred to us from that very first lesson after class, after October 7th, is that we saw that when we started talking about Oslo or the history of the conflict and the peace process, the students, maybe besides those who came from Israel and Gaza or the region, they didn't know what it was. And so we felt that we had to really go in and bring, and we brought a lot of scholars. We brought Israelis, we brought Palestinians, we brought scholars of the Middle East, we brought practitioners to do this, to educate. And that was critical, but it was a very, very difficult time.
I mean, in a way, what you're describing being played out in the classroom was going on in the broader political conversation. I'm very struck by you, Secretary Glinder, talking about that interval between the standing ovation and then being branded a war criminal. I mean, as you said, you were a loud and clear voice immediately denouncing October 7th, saying Israel had a right to defend itself. That was not a universal position in the left, broadly defined, the democratic family, democratic with a capital D. And that pattern only then became more stark in the 2 years that followed, as the losses, the deaths, including civilian deaths in Gaza, mounted. The thought that is often made, and it is made about, President Biden, but you would hear it about you, is that you are all part of a democratic, again, capital D, tradition that is in retreat, that's receding, and that now most Democrats do not feel, or not most, but the emerging generation of Democrats do not feel that instinctive attachment or empathy or understanding for Israel that you voiced on the immediate days after October 7th. Is that how you see it? Do you think the position you have is one that is slowly receding in the Democratic Party?
Yeah, Jonathan, I don't see it that way. I see it slightly differently. Because I think it's a generational issue more than a political issue. I think young people, including young Jewish Americans, don't see it that way. Mm-hmm. And part of it goes to the point Keren was just making. We have done a miserable job teaching young people history. And you know, those of us who have lived through it, you know, I went to Israel for the first time in 1980, so a long time ago, and been back many times. And obviously, you know, with my husband, you know, deeply involved in all kinds of activities to support Israel and to, you know, try to be as helpful as possible. But it was astonishing to me because I had so many conversations, and frankly, they often started as confrontations with students, not just at Columbia, but elsewhere. Where were they getting their information? They were getting it from social media. They were getting it most particularly from TikTok, which is governed by an algorithm until, at least up till now, still largely manipulated by the Chinese Communist Party. So when you were having conversations with young people, what they were seeing, and because much of the information they get, remember, more than 50% of Americans, predominantly a much bigger percentage among young people, get their news from social media. So when you were having conversations, and I would say something like, you know, if Yasser Arafat had accepted the offer that was made by my husband and the then Israeli government in 2000, there would have been a Palestinian state now for 25 years. And I cannot tell you how many times they said, "Who's Yasser Arafat?"
Wow.
When Condi Rice and I were on CBS doing our joint interview after the ceasefire, Condi, who's at Stanford and has been there, you know, except for times of public service, she had the same experience we had. You know, all those people chanting from the river to the sea, when you asked them what river, what sea, they had no idea. I mean, this is a serious problem that goes far beyond the terrible, you know, in my view, misinterpretation and unfairness that we saw post-October 7th in many different venues. And, you know, we see it in other settings as well. It's not just in the Middle East. I mean, you know, some of the confusion about Ukraine, well, who did invade? Well, it's not really debatable who invaded. But it is to some people because they don't get their news from any reliable source any longer. So I think it's more generational than anything else, and it cuts across political, religious, ethnic, racial divides. And sadly, it's not very well informed or historically, you know, rooted. So we live with what people are literally feeling, not knowing, but feeling that has been, you know, fed by the algorithms in social media.
I mean, this begs the question, Madam Secretary, next week in this city, it does seem like Mamdani will become mayor. I'm going to ask this quite bluntly. Do the Jews in this city have a reason to be concerned?
You know, we'll have to see what happens. I hope not.
The fact that this is someone who talks about, you know, doesn't denounce the slogan, globalize the Intifada. What are your thoughts when you think of that?
Look, I do not believe that we are able to predict what's going to happen. I can't sit here and tell you. I can only hope that there will be whatever happens in the election, and, you know, it hasn't occurred yet. So everybody should go out and vote. But it is important, you know, to deal with whatever the reality is next Wednesday, whatever it is, and for people to play as constructive a role as possible in making sure that, you know, we don't face the kind of, you know, worries and concerns that have been expressed.
If you had a vote in this city, would you vote for Zohran Mamdani?
You know what? I don't vote in this city. Look, I'm not involved in it. I have not, you know, been at all, even asked to be involved in it, and I have not chosen to be involved in it. I will be there the day after, and everybody else should be too, no matter what happens.
When the Dean was talking before about this loss notion and how important that is, the person who popped into my mind was Donald Trump and the loss of 2020, about which he is in denial. But the idea that he's trying to make up for that in the way you described. I'm just thinking of things you said in the 2016 campaign, Secretary Clinton, when you warned the country that this wasn't just a normal election, that there was a danger to American democracy, and not a lot of people thought you were too alarmist and you were exaggerating. I'm just wondering how you feel about that now, whether you feel you went too far or did you not go far enough?
Apparently didn't go far enough. His big domain of loss is how badly I beat him in New York. That's he never got over that either. I think, we don't have to try to, psychoanalyze too much, but I think it's fair to say that he's somebody who is governed by impulse. He's governed by feeling. He's governed by grievance. He's governed by rewards, monetary rewards, political rewards. He despises any form of accountability, whatever it might be, and he sadly has created a political environment in the Republican Party where they won't hold him accountable. And that is the biggest, you can have a rogue leader. I mean, we've had them occasionally in our states or even at the national level. But we've always counted on both institutions, the rule of law, and, people of value and dignity and stature. So, for example, when the Judiciary Committee in 1974 impeached Richard Nixon for high crimes and misdemeanors under the Constitution, leaders of the Republican Party, Barry Goldwater, for example, Howard Baker, people like that, they went to the White House and they said, Mr. President, you will be impeached in the House and you will be convicted in the Senate because the evidence is overwhelming. You should do the right thing for the country and resign. And he did. Nobody is going to the White House and saying to Donald Trump, you are engaging in lawless behavior. You are breaking every norm. You are putting our country's legal and constitutional system at risk. You've got to stop it. You've got to back off from that. You can't continue to do that without causing great damage to this wonderful country of ours. Nobody that he would listen to is trying to rein him in. Mm. And so we are in uncharted water. And I told Jonathan before I came on, I just serendipitously, I just finished reading his book called The Escape Artist about one of the give him a round of applause. But it's a book about, only 4 Jews escaped from Auschwitz, and this man, Rudolf Verbeer, is that how you say it? Verber. And another fellow Jew from Slovakia escaped. And they were motivated by this absolute intense desire to get out and tell people what was happening so that people could sound the alarm. The trains could be stopped. People wouldn't show up at, departure points. They would refuse to, be there and line up. They would rebel in some way. They would be stopped. And as Jonathan and I were talking, I mean, they get out this absolutely, breathtaking escape. And they make their way back to Slovakia, and they meet with the remaining leaders of the Jewish community who have been literally kept alive and kept in place in order to be liaisoning with the Nazis and with the collaborators. And they spend days pouring out the details that they have memorized. You know, what happened when, how people were treated, how there had been some literally show groups where people had been allowed to keep their clothes and their belongings so that if the Red Cross came, that's where they would be shown, see how nicely we're treating people, and they were kept alive for 6 months, and then they were murdered. And they went day by day almost with that level of horrific detail, and they were not believed. People have a hard time believing the unbelievable. So we can't obviously extrapolate, but I think there is a lesson here about how difficult it sometimes is for the public or the press or leaders in business or other walks of life to literally believe what they are seeing in front of their own eyes. Is that a fair assessment, Jonathan, of what you found?
You've distilled it perfectly, and the theme of the book, besides the experience of this extraordinary man in Auschwitz, was that it is not enough to get the facts into the world. People have to believe them, and that is something very different. And he discovered that in the most painful way possible, Rudolf Verber and Fred Wetzler in The Escape Artist. But what you're saying, which is very striking, is that in this moment right now, we have the facts about what, for example, is going on in this country, but you're saying people can't absorb their true significance.
Well, a lot of people don't want to deal with it. You know, the number of people who say they don't watch the news anymore, you know, they just don't want to see it. You know, that's maybe to some extent understandable, but you know, 7 million people showed up to protest a few weekends ago. So there are a lot of people who are paying attention. But a lot of leaders, political leaders, business leaders, other kind of civic leaders, they keep hoping it will somehow take care of itself. And you know, if you go back and read newspaper coverage of Hitler's rise to power, when he finally manipulated and intimidated his way into the chancellorship, there are quotes from German business leaders, including Jewish German business leaders, who say, we can handle him. We can control him. It's not that big a deal. Quit worrying. And they were so scared of the communists that they were willing to make accommodation with the fascists. And one lesson we should learn from history, and including in this country right now, if you've got a real danger from either the far right or the far left, take the far right more seriously, because the far left just doesn't have the staying power in most societies and doesn't have the public support that is able to be, created, catalyzed, because they say and do things that make no sense to most ordinary people. So, you know, the idea that our biggest worry in our country is wokeism, give me a break. I mean, literally, we are dealing with the most authoritarian threat to the future of our country that we've ever confronted, you know? And so this is something that I took away from reading your book. Obviously, I'm not extrapolating, but the idea that you would report and even see things, but be incapable, unwilling of believing not just what you're seeing, but the consequences of what next follows from what you're seeing.
You talk about the far right and the far left. I do want to talk, and we talked about Colombia, but we do need to focus on the protests and what happened in campus right after October 7th. And you, Dean, played a critical role in trying to, I think, rein that in or deal with the protest issue and the safety of students. So I think in hindsight, what do you think was the main problem, and how can you and your colleagues turn that around, or are managing to turn that around?
Yeah. I don't think that we saw it coming before October 7th. There were now looking back, and we see the fault lines, we see the issues. We see the issues in academia, we see the issues in the public discourse. But we were not prepared, not at Columbia, not anywhere else on campuses, to what happened and what we saw after October 7th. And some of it we talked about is is not knowing a lot of the facts and misinformation and not understanding history. But also, there was anti-Semitism, there was anti-Zionism in a lot of the campuses. And part of it is you look back and think about even in the departments in about Middle East, how those departments in many places have been captured by one ideology. And this is not why higher education is about. And it's not how we should teach. We should never teach our students what to think. We should teach them how to think. And we have, there were places that haven't done that. And what we saw was pretty horrible. And I have to say that at Columbia, right now, things are so different because the university, I can tell because I've been doing a lot of this work with the leadership of the university, have done so much in the last 2 years to deal with anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and to make Columbia a safe space, for a welcoming space for Jewish students, for Israeli students. And I'm glad to say, we can see of how I don't know how many of you seen pictures from campus on October 7 from Columbia. It was beautiful to see. And the students are thriving. The Jewish and Israeli students are now thriving at Columbia, and they will tell you that. There is, I understand, every Friday in Chabad, there's 300 students going to Shabbat dinners, and people tell me it feels like Hasalon or 12 chairs. And the same with Hillel, a thriving community. So the university has done a lot. And to your question, we also had a problem of not enforcing the rules of conduct, and that had to change, and we realized that. Mm-hmm. And we've done a lot in fighting that and making sure that we are consistent. We teach our students about credibility. Credibility comes from consistency. Every time if we don't enforce our rules, the rules of conduct, how would the students know where to draw the line, where the line is? So we've done that, and we have mechanisms, the Office of Institutional Equity, to deal with Title VI violations of harassment and discrimination. It's a very different campus, and I'm proud of the work that we've done, and a lot more has to happen, but we've been we were able we understood that we were facing a major problem. And that's what I feel about Columbia, that when Columbia turns a page, everybody notices that. And I'm glad that we were able to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm going to sound like one of your students now, I think, or both of you, which is, I want to ask you, Secretary Clinton, for a big sort of picture assessment of the region, the Middle East region, because obviously the last 2 years have been painful and horrendous. The loss of life on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side in Gaza, immense. Taking one step back, though, after these 2 years, are the prospects for the region actually now better in the sense that Assad has gone, Hezbollah and Iran are weakened, that there is now, even if it's very fragile, some kind of arrangement there? Overall, are we in a much better place than we were?
I think that is possible, and I hope it's so, because as you point out, we have seen such shifts in the region. It's not clear yet what will happen, but if we have the right kind of diplomacy, the right carrots and sticks, the right kind of engagement, we need to be much more proactive in trying to figure out what's going to happen in Syria. The story is not anywhere. I think it's maybe the end of the first or second chapter, but, a lot of chapters to come. We have to do everything possible to support the legitimate government and military of Lebanon and try to prevent a resurgence of Hezbollah. They've not gone away. They've been, decapitated by their leadership. But don't be mistaken. If they can figure out some angle to, come back, they will. And the same with Iran. Iran has been, I think, put on its back foot, but they're by no means done. They are still an implacable foe of the United States and Israel. They still want to dominate the region if they can, try to reconstitute their proxies, particularly Hezbollah, try once again to control more of Syria to continue to pose a threat to Israel. So the other sides of this are all, as we speak in this beautiful place tonight, they are all meeting, trying to figure out how to get back on the offensive. What's going to happen in Syria, what's going to happen in Lebanon, what's going to happen to Hezbollah, what's going to happen inside Iran. So we've got to be smart about keeping the pressure on, and it can't just be Israeli-U.S. pressure, as important as that is, which has to be, certainly the organizing principle of the pressure. We have to keep the rest of the region on board. That's why bombing Qatar, with all of, Qatar's issues, and believe me, they are many, bombing was, not the smartest thing to do if we're going to try to, manage the region to move us toward even greater stability, to further integrate Israel. I mean, obviously, the first time I met as Secretary of State with Bibi, literally the first words out of his mouth is, how do we get normalization with Saudi Arabia? And that was in 2009. That was the very beginning of our conversation. I'd met with him many times on different kinds of settings before, but this was as Secretary of State. So there's still a lot of cards to be played. And that's why I said in the beginning, I do give credit to the Trump team for getting us where we are, but now the hard work starts. If this were easy, it would have been done before, because it's not like people haven't tried. So I think it's important that we look at the region and the potential for the region and the integration of Israel in the region and the stability of the region, but that's going to take an enormous amount of discipline and effort.
You say it's not like people haven't tried. We're sitting here, and November 4th is going to mark 30 years since the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. You knew him well. There was a very special relationship between you and former President Clinton and him. Do you have that kind of fear? Perhaps maybe he was the last person who could have actually, because of being a general, turning to the path of peace, perhaps he was the last person who could have tried to do that and succeed.
Well, clearly, look, the opponents of peace are not just on one side, as we know, because of the history-changing assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. My husband absolutely loved him, and he loved him because he was a man of strength and integrity, and he was willing to do something really, really hard. Mm-hmm. And that was to try to make peace with his enemy. It's easy to talk about this, but he was a soldier, he was a military leader, but he had become a civilian politician leader, and he understood that he had to make that effort. And he did. And of course, he was murdered by an Israeli who opposed what he was trying to do. And when it came down to it with Yasser Arafat, because, my husband's latest book, Citizen, he goes into much more detail about the negotiations with Arafat. And Arafat promised him he would take the deal. And then he literally got scared because he thought he would be killed. And so, the offer was made to provide protection, et cetera, et cetera. So when people are trying to make peace with their enemies, their sworn enemies, people they know have either themselves killed or ordered the killing of their friends and their comrades and civilians, I mean, that takes a level of courage that, Yitzhak Rabin had. And it was something that I think did set history back. But, people kept going. They kept trying. Barak tried, Olmert tried, Sharon tried. Mm-hmm. These were very different men coming from often a very different political position, but they were Israeli patriots, and they understood why they were trying to bring about peace with their enemy. And so these are the people that I give credit for, the people in the arena who are willing to make the hard choices, because there is not an easy choice on the path to peace there or anywhere else.
in our closing couple of minutes, we've talked so much about the history of this and where we are now. I want to ask both of you to look to the future in this very particular way, which is, what have you seen? And it may actually be in the classroom at Columbia, but it may be just in the events of the world. What have each of you seen that encourages you for the future? Let's start with you, Dean Yarhi-Milo.
So I have to say that part of the reason that I'm in academia and part of the reason why I love higher education and universities is the interaction with young people, especially the kind of students who are, you see how they look and they try to make sense of the world, but you see the passion, you see the curiosity, you see the desire to try to, change the world, make it a better place. And it's a journey. And they're not, and we see I see them when they come as freshmen. And by the time they graduate from graduate school, from SIPA, you see the evolution in how they think. But I love when I see students coming to us, in questions in class and ask questions that Hillary and I spend then hours thinking about and talking about, because they're so insightful. And I am inspired by the students that we have, and this is important. They are going to be the change makers of tomorrow, and very, very lucky to have them at Columbia as students.
So I recently met with an Israeli student at SIPA, a young woman who was in the IDF in Unit 8200 when October 7th happened, and was on a base in the south that they later learned Hamas had targeted, but didn't get there. And she finished her military service, and then, like a lot of our Israeli students, came to Columbia and started her studies after her military service was ended. And so I had a conversation with her about her aspirations. What does she want to do after she gets this great degree? And of course, she wants to be Keren, but we'll see whether that works out or not. But she basically said that she really wanted to go back to Israel, and she wanted to be part of building what she viewed as sort of the next iteration of Israel. I mean, the founding story, the sacrifice, the war, then the economic development, the social cohesion, despite all the arguments, the kind of, success that Israel represented. And then, obviously, what's gone on even before, October 7th, with how is Israel going to define itself? What sort of principles would it be really embodying? And she wants to be part of that next generation of Israelis who take a hard look at the history, but also the fundamental values of Israel, and contribute to a stronger, prosperous, safer, values-driven country. And that's what Keren and I get to see. We talk to Chinese students who want to go back to China, and if there's ever a chance to be part of a different kind of China. We talk to Iranian, American students who, want to see the end of the, regime in Iran. We talk to students who are very hopeful that they can play a role in, bringing freedom and democracy, to their own countries, or building on what has already been built, as in the case of Israel. So, that certainly gives us hope. We're lucky enough to interact with those young people on, a very regular basis, and it's very reassuring. As long as they get off TikTok, that's the only thing. The only thing I tell them is, like, okay, put away the social media and think about how you can actually deliver on what you hope to be part of building.
And learn
That
more
is a-
history. That's the
That is a good point to end on. Dr. Keren Yarhi-Milo and Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, thank you so much for talking
Thank
to
you.
us about